Hello and welcome to Faith and Lit, a podcast exploring the intersection of books and belief. I'm your hostess with the mostess, Xandra Carroll. Our current series is Talking Tolkien, and I'm joined by my fellow book nerds, Kasey Leander and Dr. Simon Barry. This week, we're looking at Tolkien's perspective on keeping going. Let's join the guys. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Faith and Lit, where we are discussing the intersection of faith and literature. Today, we're going to be starting a new series on Tolkien. We're calling it Talking Tolkien. And joining me today are two colleagues of mine. One of them is called Kasey Leander. Like me, he is an apologist, and he gives a lot of public speeches all around the world, and he's very fascinated in literature and very well versed. Also joining us is Dr. Simon Barry, coming all the way from the UK. Thank you for joining us, who is an expert on Tolkien. And this first episode that we're going to be doing today is Tolkien on keeping going. Tolkien on keeping going, which is a big topic about hope and perseverance. Actually, just before we get started, before we launch in, I'm wondering, Simon, would you just take a couple of moments and introduce yourself?
Of course. So as you've heard, my name's Simon. I grew up in Oxford, the city where Tolkien spent most of his life. And I was first exposed to him, I think, when I was 5 years old, and my father decided that The Hobbit was good bedtime reading for a small boy, which left me with two things, two legacies. One was a fear of spiders, and the other was an interest in fantasy literature. I pestered him to let me read Lord of the Rings, and he eventually consented when I was 9, and thereafter I read it on an annual basis for most of my adult life. I feel a little bit of a fraud in some ways, in that my PhD, my doctoral qualification is actually in medieval theology, which is a field of great interest to Tolkien, but it's not actually on him. I'm a little bit of a self-appointed expert, I suppose, in that regard. But I've been very interested for many years in the interactions between faith, history, literature, and philosophy, and especially in Tolkien, because he's been one of my favourite writers since before I learned to read, and certainly since I did so. So a while ago, I got asked to produce a series of articles and a series of lectures on Tolkien, and talking to Xandra and Kasey, we thought it would be fun to do some videos on them. So that's what I'm doing here today.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And Kasey, would you mind just introducing yourself a bit and talk about your interest in this area as well?
Absolutely, yeah. Like you, Xandra, I'm an apologist, so I like to talk about the tough questions, tough objections people have to Christian belief, and I really rejoice in that conversation, because I think we need more honest conversations about the tough questions, and I think that keeps my faith fresh, is hearing from skeptics, and really people maybe who even wouldn't consider themselves skeptical. They just have different viewpoints, and so I love that intersection. So that's what I do. But my interest in Tolkien is very keen. I read these books, and I don't quite have Simon level like annual basis, but I too love them, and I'm not ashamed to say that the films, the Lord of the Rings trilogy, were absolutely foundational to me as a middle schooler. Like they just changed everything. So I love them dearly, and I'm just thrilled to be a part of this conversation. So
awesome. Well, it's wonderful to have you both, and thank you for making the time. Dr. Barry, I just wondered if I could ask you, what do you think sets Tolkien's view of hope, or his presentation of perseverance, apart from other authors, or what really is unique about his view and his presentation of hope?
I think hope is one of those things that gets treated very shallowly in a lot of works. The reasons why people are hopeful, and particularly I think persistently and enduringly hopeful when it's hard to be hopeful, are often not given a lot of depth. But in Tolkien's universe, the reasons why his characters are hopeful are absolutely founded in a very thought out understanding of the world he has created and the way in which hope is fed by your worldview, your understanding of the world, the way in which that informs what you can expect, and your philosophy, and if you like, theology of life, what you think the fundamental realities are. I think as well, part of the reason you get that kind of depth in Tolkien is that Tolkien's own life was full of challenges to hope. His life was not an easy one. I think sometimes people criticize his work as being naively idealistic and not very realistic. And they forget that Tolkien had more experience of the darkness of life than most modern authors dream of. He lost his father and then his mother when he was a small child, primary school age. He was taken to a strange land, the UK, having grown up in South Africa, and left with family who he scarcely knew, having just lost both his parents. They sent him away to a strange boarding school where he made a new set of friends who became a new family to him. And then the First World War came along, and Tolkien, the rather shy, sensitive academic, went and fought in the Battle of the Somme, the bloodiest battle in British history, and basically all those new friends of his died. And he witnessed the horrors of the trench warfare. He contracted trench fever. He was separated for years from the girl he loved, had to wait 5 years before he could get back in touch with her. And even after all that had happened and he'd come home from the First World War, he came back to a countryside that he loved, that was being dismantled by the Industrial Revolution, to a Britain that was being hit by the Great Depression. And then after all his friends had suffered and died in the war that was supposed to end all wars, Tolkien saw his own sons go out to fight in the Second World War. His own son, Christopher, served in the RAF, which in the First World War had an average life expectancy, I think, of a couple of weeks. And it's while all this is going on that Tolkien is writing Lord of the Rings. He's writing it while Europe is collapsing and being completely overrun by Hitler's Germany, while his sons are on the front line in another world war, looking back on a country that seems to have been falling apart and on the loss of his early years that seems to have accomplished nothing. Tolkien had reasons to be gloomy, but his works, while they're often dark, are laced through with an indestructible thread of hope. And I think his own hope must have been put through the fire and forged into something unbreakable to have survived all that. And I think that's why hope in his works has such depth and strength and power to it, because it's rooted in a man who had walked very dark roads, but had held on to the light. Sorry, that was a long answer.
No, it's a wonderful answer. Thank you. So Simon, I recently read one of your articles, which you published through Mentsche Magazine, and we will have the link to that at the bottom. And it's on this topic of keeping going and Tolkien's view of hope and perseverance. And I wanted to just read a quote from that and ask you a couple of questions. But first, I'm wondering if you want to plug that article or give some background to that.
So perhaps it's helpful to give a little bit of background to that quote, because it's from a slightly obscure work of Tolkien's called The Debate of Finrod and Andreth, or the Afrobe Finrod or Andreth in the Sindarin. It's in Morgoth's Ring, which is one of Christopher Tolkien's volumes on the history of Middle-earth. But the context is it's a conversation between an elven lord, Finrod, and a mortal woman, Andreth. A mortal woman who has been in love with Finrod's brother, but Finrod's brother has left her, essentially. And she's finding it understandably very hard to cope with. And they have a conversation, therefore, that starts with her anger and resentment against the elves, but then becomes a conversation about the nature of humanity, and particularly why are humans mortal? Why do humans age and die? And in the light of our mortality, can we have hope? In the light of the inevitability of death and all that it implies about mankind's fallen nature, about us not being any more what we were made to be, can we have hope? And Andreth doesn't have much hope, but Finrod is suggesting that there are still reasons for her to hope even when evil seems to have won and destroyed human nature. And that's the context of this conversation, which I think you wanted to read.
So it said, "Have ye then no hope?" said Finrod. "What is hope?" she said. "An expectation of good, which, though uncertain, has some foundation in what is known. Then we have none." "That is one thing that men call hope," said Finrod. "Amdir, we call it, looking up. But there is another which is founded deeper. Estel, we call it, that is, trust. It is not defeated by the ways of the world, for it does not come from experience, but from our nature and first being." So what I wanted to ask you is, what do you think the difference between these two types of hope is in Tolkien's view? This Amdir, as we call it, the looking up, versus Estel, which is a trust.
Thank you. It's a really deep question. And I think this gets to the heart of the depth of hope for Tolkien's characters. Because Tolkien's works are full of characters who despair. If you know The Lord of the Rings, the character of Denethor is a great example. He has a seeing stone that lets him see what's going on in the world. He sees how powerful Sauron, the enemy, is, and he despairs, and it destroys him. His counterpart, Theoden, the king of the Rohirrim, also sees the power of the enemy, but he hopes. And therefore Theoden's story ends in joy. Denethor's ends in horror and grief. You could say as well that the key to Lord of the Rings, the reason good wins, is that Frodo and Sam, the hobbits, persevere. They keep their trusts, they keep going. They don't give up, even though it looks impossible that they should ever achieve what they're trying to do. Gandalf himself calls their mission a fool's hope. And Frodo and Sam fairly quickly get to the point where they don't expect to succeed, but they keep going anyway. And because they do, Middle-earth is saved. The victory is not in the end won by the frantic valor of Aragorn on the field of battle to the sound of trumpets. It's won by two little hobbits getting out of bed every morning and keeping on walking through a nightmare of sand and dust and ash and darkness, when there's no reason to think they could ever succeed, but they keep doing the right thing. So what's the difference? What makes the hobbits or Theoden hope when Denethor can't? Well, the difference between these two types of hope, Amdir, the looking up, is it's looking with the eyes of what we might reasonably expect from this world. It's looking with the expectation of this world. If we and the things we see are all there is, are the only powers at work, Amdir is what we could reasonably expect. So I could say, I hope that there will be milk in the supermarket next week, and that is Amdir. That is a reasonable hope, because, based on the fact that the supermarket usually has milk. If the supermarket never has milk, then I could not have that sort of hope. I could not have Amdir, because it would not be reasonable to, in terms of how I have seen the world to work, to expect that hope was there. I'm trying to avoid calling it rational hope, because I think actually Estel is rational as well, but it's rational within a different starting point. Because Estel is not hope based on, I can see a reason why this would happen as I look around. Estel is hope saying, I cannot see any reason why this would happen, but I trust. Estel is trust, and it's particularly trust in the character of the one who is telling the story. Estel is sometimes translated trust, sometimes faith, sometimes hope. It's quite like the Greek word pistis in the New Testament in that regard. And Estel is hope that is not founded on seeing a reason why this is going to happen as I look around me. It's founded on saying, if this story is being told by the author I know, then this is how it is going to end. I think it's a little bit like, you've probably had the experience of reading a book by an author you know well, you've read a lot of their stuff, and it gets to the point in the book where it looks like it's all going to be a disaster and the good guys are going to lose, but you know the author doesn't write that sort of book. And so you know that there's going to be a happy ending. that things are going to change. You can't see how it'll happen, but you know it will, because they're that kind of author. That's the kind of story they tell. And Estel, Finrod is saying, is hope that is founded in saying, I know something about the author who's telling this story. So as he says, if we are indeed the Eruhin, the children of the One, the children of the Creator, if the one who has made this whole world and set it in motion, if he's the one telling this story, then I know a bit about what the ending's going to be. Because I know he's not going to make the ending a sad one for his children, because he cares about us. And I think this is why in Tolkien, hope is almost always linked to the beauty of creation. Because creation tells you about the Creator. Creation opens a window onto the character of the author. So those great, if you know Lord of the Rings, that great moment where Sam is on the edge of despair in Mordor and expresses a wish to just see clean air and light. And then for a moment, the sky's clear, and looking up above the cloud rack, he sees a single star burning bright. And burningly, the thought struck him clear and remote that there was light and beauty up there which no shadow could touch. And he goes back to his perseverance because he's seen the stars again. And they've told him, well, he's seen the stars incredibly remote, speaking to the vastness of the universe and the power of its creator, and incredibly beautiful, speaking to his goodness and his benevolence. If the creator of the universe is that powerful and makes things of that much beauty, then the story of our world is going to end in beauty, because he's got the power to make it so and the goodness to desire it to be so. And so whenever people find hope in Tolkien, it's usually looking at the stars most often. Sometimes it's trees and mountains. Occasionally it's music or flowers. In Beren's case, it's the beauty of Luthien as she dances in the forest. But the beauty of creation is what gives people hope. And again, that's the case, because hope is, because the beauty of creation is a reminder and an emblem of what the Creator is like. And therefore, Estel is born of it. The food of Estel is the beauty of creation, because it tells us this is what the Creator's like, so trust him.
Simon, I'd love to ask you just on that note, and by the way, thank you for that breakdown of Amdir versus Estel. I loved reading that in your article. I think that makes Tolkien's work pop so much more to me, even just having that understanding. As I think about Tolkien's races that he created, I want to know your take on what hope looks like for the different races of Tolkien's world, because you have these elves and they seem to just immediately and obviously comprehend the transcendent beauty of the world. They're filled with Estel because in some sense they're tied to Middle Earth very intimately. And then you have men, and they seem to be more of a wild card. So I wonder if you could just speak to what hope looks like, or what Tolkien meant to tell us by how hope looks for the different races in Middle Earth.
Thank you. Again, this comes up actually in the Afrabeth, in the debate of Finrod and Andreth, because they have this discussion about hope for men and elves and how it's different. I think it's easy to forget that in Lord of the Rings, the elves we meet are the survivors of 5,000 years of war. They've been through the fire. The elves we meet in the Silmarillion are not always as wise. Indeed, they make mistakes, sometimes quite big and terrible ones, and they do despair sometimes. The characters like Elrond and Galadriel have been forged in the fire, and those who did not come out of that with Estel have left Middle-earth. So perhaps that's why they can come across as almost annoyingly perfect sometimes. They're perfect because, or they're so close to it because all the ones who weren't are dead or gone or both. So what does Estel look like? How is it different for elves and men? Well, one of the differences, as you've identified, is that elves are much more tightly tied to this world, to this creation. When an elf dies, they go back to Valinor, to the halls of waiting there. One or two of them, like Glorfindel, get to come back in a body, but that's another discussion. When men die, nobody knows where they go in Tolkien's world. Their souls are not given into the care of the Vala, the angelic guardians of the world. They pass out of the world and no one knows what happens to them. Which is one reason why, again, if you know Lord of the Rings, Elrond is so reluctant to see Arwen choose a mortal life and join her lot with Aragorn, because she's not just being separated from her people in life, but in death. And he doesn't know what will happen to her after she dies. It's a big, big deal. So for the elves, hope is much more closely tied to hope for creation, hope for the physical world, and therefore is particularly and intensely found in physical beauty and the beauty of physical creation. The stars are especially significant for them because when the elves first awoke, there was no sun or moon in Tolkien's universe. The only light was the stars. And so when they awoke at the waters of Coiviennen, the stars were the only light to see. And so the stars have ever since spoken to the elves of light and darkness. When men first awoke, they were surrounded by smogs and mists, and it was the first rising of the sun that burnt them off. And so the sun has always for men been more a symbol of hope. But what you also see is that the wisest of Tolkien's men, their hope is beyond the world. Their hope is beyond this life. And perhaps the most powerful example of this is Aragorn. Aragorn, whose true name, his mother name, is Estel, who almost is the embodiment, as he is the locus of faith for his people. But when he is dying, many years later, in the appendices, he has a conversation with Arwen, who is understandably upset about his impending death. And Aragorn admits that it's grievous, but says, "Let us not fail at the last, who of old renounced both the shadow and the ring. In darkness we must go, but not in despair. For behold, we are not bound to the circles of this world, and beyond them is more than memory. Farewell." And he dies. For men, hope is in death. Death is almost the door of hope, because it takes you out of this world with its troubles and its problems. And Tolkien's characters don't know where they go when that happens, but they trust the one who has made them, who has made their world. They trust that they're going to something good. And really what determines whether a man, a human in Tolkien's stories, turns good or turns evil, perhaps more than anything else, is their attitude to death. Numenor falls when its people start trying to escape death and cling to life, even by wrong means. And the ultimate example of that is the Nazgûl, the Nine, who take these rings in an effort to cling to life, and as a result are trapped in an undeath. And there's a very powerful, perhaps unintentional symbolism, or there's a deeper truth encapsulated very simply in that if you try and cling to life with all you've got and cannot bear letting go of it, you will poison the life you have until it becomes an undeath at best. But the characters like Aragorn, who accept their death, and even though they don't know where they're going to go, hope, they're the ones who remain unfallen. And they're the ones who go into battle fearlessly because they know that the worst can happen to them is that they die and they go out of this world and into the hands of their maker. So Theoden, in his hour, Húrin Thalion, taking his stand at the last, at the Ninaife Arnoediad and covering the retreat of Gondolin. Aragorn refusing to cling to life beyond his time and accepting death. Estel for men is about accepting when their hour has come, accepting their mortality, but trusting that it's not the end.
Well, that's all the time we have for this week. But join us next time as we continue the discussion on Tolkien's views of keeping going. Thanks for tuning in to the Faith and Lit podcast.